Welcome, everybody. And I'd like to go ahead, maybe just go around and see where people are with their particular activities, or maybe just their life in general. It snowed here in Southern Virginia, which is I think it's been a couple of years since we actually. I know, right? I think it's actually been a couple of years since we've actually had a noticeable snowfall. So that was a thing here. But we're still at work. We got that. We're enduring with the half an inch of snow. That's about all I have to report. Let's go to Mindy next.
I was gonna say, why don't we start with Jamie, since I feel like she could say more about our project.
Oh yeah,
Sure.
Jamie. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's fine. We're also getting snow, but like a
Yours
little bit
here.
more,
That's fine.
a little bit more than you are right now.
That's my.
Maybe-
You remember,
where are
I'm from Central New York, so I appreciate the levels. So
Yeah, I now have a different perception of like when you need to shovel and when you can just drive over it. Like that
Yeah.
totally changed living up here. So I'm Jamie. I'm working with Mindy, who's my screen next to me. And my project is using a flipped classroom to teach an ethics class. For the flipped classroom and it being all discussion based, that's clearly a little bit more complicated with us being online this semester. So I'm actually just opening it to the grad students because they're the ones who are on campus. And hopefully we'll bring the undergrads in next year. But in terms of class size and undergrad willingness to come to campus, that was just a difficult decision I had to make this semester.
So you're doing an implementation right now, just with a different population than you expected?
Yes, yeah. Last year it was grads and undergrads and it was pretty evenly split. But yeah, I'm just more comfortable being with the grad students in a small classroom than I am with undergrads and grad students, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And a lot of the undergrads just don't want to come back. So
Makes sense. And this is it full semester?
we're shortened by a week and we have like 2 or 3 wellness days, which actually doesn't impact my class, but I'm trying to squish everything down into 13 weeks straight now.
I had asked because I remember that in grad school that you had to do some ethics training, but it was just it was more casual, and yours sounds like a more formal class. So
Yeah, so with the ethics training, I'm doing it based on NIH requirements because that's the strictest, and that actually only requires 8 contact hours covering 8 different topics. So I do have a little bit of leeway in terms of what I do the additional weeks. And because it is ethics based, we actually try to do a little bit more like group building and teamwork building, because if we're going to talk about really controversial things, I want the students to feel comfortable having those conversations with other people in the class. And I tell them everything we talk about, doesn't leave the classroom. But in the future, I would actually like it to be 2 separate classes because I think the topics you cover with undergrads are different than grad students. But the undergrads seemed to like it last year, but yeah, there wasn't, I would like them to be 2 separate classes in the future.
I actually have, it's a microcosm of that, but I teach a bioethics class here regularly because it's a popular non-majors class for a graduation requirement. And I do 2 flavors of it. So we don't have grad students, but I do a freshman only version and an upper class version. And it absolutely is different in terms of the attitudes, interest levels, things like that. So yeah, I know, I could see why you would want to keep those populations maybe separate in the way you offered it.
Yeah, and just one, Karen wanted to know where I'm at SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry in Syracuse.
It's not quite Buffalo, but it's right up there.
We're pretty snowy still.
Yeah. Karen, let's go to you next.
Oh, hi everyone. I recognize some of you. I recognize some of your names. I work at a small liberal arts college right outside of Atlanta. It's cold here, no snow, but I see why you guys got a little chilly in Virginia. And I was came to Palm with my mentee 7 years ago, I guess. So I'm in the veteran ranks, and I'm on sabbatical this spring. So I love this. I mean, like this is great time for me. I really appreciate, Michael, you putting these things together. I do a small journal club amongst my peers here at Oglethorpe. That's kind of how I try and stay connected and how manage it logistically. I do think that question of extra outside of your institution support and inside of your institution support is really interesting, and one of the things that comes up in this paper, and maybe we'll get to talk about that. But I teach in biology And yeah, it's really good to be with you all and take some of your energy, which I'm trying to restore mine. I'm honestly, I'm a little worn out after last fall and everything that COVID demands. So obviously that's another twist on this paper we're reading. It's like this paper pre-COVID, this paper post-COVID. You know. Anyway, I'm so happy to be with you all. Thanks for letting me come.
I've been working on in another project. We just had a paper accepted that was a perspectives piece on one of these special editions every education journal is putting out about life in the time of COVID. So it's like, okay, this has been crappy for all of us, but at least we're extracting some publications out of it.
Yeah.
If I want to be like brutally cynical and calculating, it's like, okay, well, at least you got that going for us. Why don't you Rivka next?
Hi, everyone. I'm Rivka. I am just outside of Baltimore, Maryland. I teach at Stevenson University.
The best background of the group. That's really nice.
And I teach, let's say I joined Palm, I want to say, I don't even, 2019, something like that.
Right. Yeah.
And I've been working with my mentor, Dina Newman, who's at Rochester Institute of Technology. And she has been helping me flip my classroom, my genetics class. So I teach primarily a 200 level genetics class. And I, dabbled in flipped classroom a little bit before joining Palm. And then this gave me the courage to do an entire flipped classroom. And I just, thinking about some of the things that came out of this paper and stuff, we were just up for, doing a whole appraisal process. And I met with we have committees, that we meet with as we go up for promotion. And so I'm up for promotion next year. And when I met with my committee, I crunched the data from my student evaluations, when I did a flipped classroom and then a non-flipped classroom. And it was really interesting to see this big jump in student engagement and, just on the, jump on the positive side from when I flipped to went to a flipped classroom to a non-flipped classroom. And I think that data really helped to, gain my chair support, which I already had, but this sort of kind of cemented it. So, that is definitely due in part to my participation in Palm and giving me the courage to go all the way with a flipped classroom.
That's awesome to hear, because one of the things I think we'll start looking at going forward is efficacy of some of the actual individual cures that have been going on and evidence, not just that active learning is taking place, but that active learning has had effects. And so it's really cool to hear that you've had success in that regard. So it's very cool. Zach, how about you?
Hey, good morning, y'all. I'm up in Duluth, Minnesota. It's been real cold here recently, which is wonderful. We actually finally have winter for once. Snow's okay, not great. I teach at the College of St. Scholastica, and my project is working with Jane Wissinger, a green chemist down in the Twin Cities campus, a colleague of Sue's, on working on some active learning for an intro level chemistry and sustainability class. And we're trying to keep things as asynchronous as possible to allow for inclusion and and inclusivity and acknowledgement that students are all over the place right now. And we actually have a pretty cool project going on, which is that my students are pursuing sustainability in their communities, a project about that. And then my mentor students are going to serve my mentor students are going to serve as mentors to my students. So they're going to be checking in with their project and helping them with the chemistry as my students generally don't have very strong of a chemistry background. And so it's a really cool asynchronous collaboration where my students are talking about their communities, and then my mentor students are helping them with some of the more difficult chemistry, because we can only talk so much about chem before they get bored to tears. So I'm really excited to see. I can't spend the whole semester doing chem because that would defeat the purpose of a sustainability class. So I'm really excited to see where it goes, and I think it has a really nice way to be flexible with student schedules, but also participate in some self-guided inquiry, and I'm really excited about it. It's very much not the project that we proposed, but that's okay, because we're modifying and grooving, and I'm really excited about it. So thank you for listening.
Very exciting. Thank you. Carlos, let's have you check in next.
I'm Carlos Scholar, and I'm at NC State, and I'm teaching this semester a yeast metabolic engineering class online, and doing worksheets and case studies.
It's going all right. I say that because I've seen Carlos more than some of the other people, so I have more of a nuanced, like, and are you holding up? Is that going all right?
It's true, kind of. Troubleshooting some.
We're actually doing, we're trying to analyze some of the COPUS data from PALM that many of you have helped us collect. And I have a lot less experience with this kind of research. And so Carlos recently introduced me to the services where one can get a transcript done. And I was amazed by the ease with which one could just send in a video or something like that. And then a day, literally 9 hours later, here's your full transcript. I'm like, oh,
yeah,
brave new world we live in here. This is actually really cool. Okay, I've gone all the way around the horn. Mindy, anything to add to what Jamie said, or are we all good?
No, I mean, I think obviously Jamie said it all. I'm Mindy. I'm at Washington College, which is in Chestertown, Maryland. I've been there for, I think this is like my 13th year. I don't know, time flies. I'm really enjoying being part of like this network. Jamie and I talk frequently. I think she's also been really helpful in my class. This semester I'm teaching a cell molecular class, so we've been kind of talking even a little bit how I can implement and change some things. So it's been kind of great. Like, I guess it says I'm her mentor, but I feel like it's just full circle for both of us, to bounce ideas off of each other.
Very
great.
Cool. And Sue, any maybe updates, announcements, things to share with the group?
I'm just saying the Twin Cities of Minnesota, it is, as Zach said, warmer than usual until this past week. I'm teaching teachers this semester on well-being, evidence-based practices for well-being, and it's all active learning, so we sneak that in whenever we can. In terms of PALM, my project for the last couple of weeks has been matching prospective fellows. I've gotten over 6, 7 people contacting me saying, point me to a mentor. So that takes a little bit of scrambling. I try to send each of them 3 or 4 names. I realized that I was surveyed for this paper. I filled out one of the surveys for this paper, but it got discarded because I was in the very first Summer Institute that went public, the 2004 one. So. Wow.
Okay, so speaking of the paper, let's transition over. This is always very interesting for me because for me, this is my 3rd time talking through this paper. And the first 2 times we did it, there were 2 different points of emphasis depending on the people in the crowd and what the particular interests were. So I'm very curious to see where we head here. And if these things interest you too, we post all these recordings on the PALM website, and so you too can go back and look at the different iterations of these conversations that we've had. So what we have here is one of many papers that we've thought about that has a simple but important goal. Like, what can we do to best help people to integrate concepts in active learning into their class? And so, as Sue alluded to, this is the result of a survey from several alums of the Summer Institutes. And the idea was to look at supports and to look at barriers to what enables or hinders people to do active learning in their class, with the idea of seeing where are the greatest connections, correlations that would inform directions for potential reform. And so you have here a very simple but critical figure about what is going on in terms of predictors and outcomes, the idea of the positive and the negative, the supports and the barriers. And so what can we be doing to help you the most? Can we be adding more things that are positive? can we be taking things away that are negative? This is, of course, not mutually exclusive. You can be doing some of both. But what the paper is seeking to ask is, what is most important? Where are these connections, and what strategies can we glean from them? And so you end up here with table 1. And this is where I, as somebody, again, less experienced with this variety of research, I had to think this part through a little bit about the definition of a support and the definition of a barrier. You see here the examples of responses that they received and the broad characterization of those responses into 4 big categories: academic receptivity, logistical concerns, student receptivity, and then personal teaching preferences. And so looking at all of this, I look at what a support is, I look at what a barrier is. And if you look at the example items, in many cases, it seems to be taking the same idea and just twisting it positive versus negative. And so for me, I needed a little more time, I think, to go through this and think about what this group is trying to get at in terms of considering what is a positive, what is a support, and what is a negative, what is a barrier, and how in some cases it can be 2 sides of the same coin, but there are distinct variances to consider in terms of what we would consider supportive, what we would consider a barrier. So just to set the table here for what it is trying to be done. Any questions on those sort of setups, things like that? I will say one of the things that we've talked about in the last couple iterations is the fact that this data is coming from Summer Institute alums. And so because of that, it's a perfectly good set of data. It is a set of data that will be skewed towards people at larger universities, which is certainly something to bear in mind as you're looking at this.
Michael and Sue, obviously, I've never done a Summer Institute, so I was just wondering how many people here have, and then for these various kind of items, does this really align with the objectives and outcomes of the SIs, like in terms of how they formulated this and came up with the categories? Is that something that was an easy transition from some of the objectives of the SI curriculum?
I would say the SI really focuses on things like the logistics. How do you actually deliver active learning in a classroom, no matter what kind of classroom you have? And you spend the better part of the 4 days or however long they are now, focusing on doing that within a group that you're in, usually of 7, 8, 9 people, something like that. The last day, there's always some focus on your institution. And so that would get at the academic receptivity part. But I would say those are the 2 main things emphasized.
So this was kind of a couple steps. It took an arc out or a step out from the nuts and bolts of what happens at the SI sessions.
So.
Michael, I might also suggest, and perhaps Sue can speak to this because I don't have a whole lot of experience with SI, but if—
Neither do I, so I'm deferring all this to Sue.
Well, there you go. Okay, well then, Sue, I could imagine that there could be some self-selection bias here, right? That not only is it skewed to large universities, it's skewed to people who will naturally want to attend SI, which, or because they're there, which then might suggest that they're potentially more receptive or open or excited about these ideas than other folks. But
Yeah,
I don't know how cross-cutting SI is, so that's the nature of my question.
Right now it's opened up to much more than research institutions, but it's true that it was big R1 institutions at the beginning. And there were people who were told they had to go by a department head or a dean or somebody. So there were, and I used to get them in my group because I used to facilitate at Summer Institutes, and there'd always be one in the room, that would be there against his or her better judgment and desires. And we would joke about it, but yeah, there were people mostly who bought in and were there voluntarily.
And then another question, Sue, kind of based on that one, in terms of like support for going to these, is this like covered by the department? Because I have to imagine if like the department's not going to pay for somebody to go, then they're probably not going to pay for the flights and the hotels to actually. So I guess that kind of goes in with like the departmental and college support versus like, do people kind of have to do this on their own?
The funding has evolved. It's been very different over the course of it. At the beginning, it was all expenses paid. There were grants from HHMI and NSF to cover participant costs, and all the facilitators are there as volunteers. Then it became something where there was some small fee involved, I think, for some of them. And now the Institute comes to you. There are mobile summer institutes, and the facilitators for free go and deliver at some other place than wherever they are.
Sort of the sustainability aspect of it then.
Mm-hmm.
So see here, and that the repeatedly throughout this paper they talk about EBT, which I immediately am like, oh, electronic bank transfer. I'm like, oh no, evidence-based teaching. We had to redefine what we meant by this. And so you see here categories of supports, and then there's also the categories of barriers. And so what you have here, it's important to notice the asterisks after some of the terms. So you'll see here, significantly related to implementation. So which ones are most closely maybe critical to our conversation. And then the other interesting thing here would be just the percentage of people who actually respond in the affirmative to these relating to their own particular on their own particular environments. And so I'd be curious to know for you guys on this particular list, are there particular things that strike you as particularly important to your own adaptation of active learning into your classroom, cultural support, things like that, how you actually get students to do group activities, things like that. This comes up more for me with the barriers, but are there supports here that you find especially relevant to your own teaching and your own integration of active learning?
So something which I was thinking about a lot as I was reading this is probably more of a cynical point of where my institution is. So we're unfortunately going through like a lot of reductions, and we're having to reduce the number of faculty. And it started making me think that, of course, the people who are untenured are unfortunately the ones that are being targeted to start, as much as I hate that. And they're obviously the ones who I feel like are much more implementing these practices. And so I'm starting to worry about how much these practices are going to be able to be continued if we're left with more senior people who are more against them. And I don't want to say people in my department are against them, but it's definitely like the younger faculty who more implement them. So I feel like there's a little bit of an administrative barrier, and sometimes because they're getting rid of these younger, more innovative faculty members.
Yeah, and I think I like your clarification there that a lot of times it's not you're against these things, it's that there's a inertia to things, sort of a that's the way it's always been done attitude, and that assessment is always a concern, right? And so if you're not assessing things in a way that we would consider good for seeing the efficacy of some of these results, and you're just like, oh, well, my students seem to be doing okay, they seem to be getting good grades, therefore what I am doing works. There wouldn't be much of an impetus to change things. Actually, Rivka, can I come to you for a sec? Because you were talking about the assessment that you were able to take to your administration. Can I ask you what you were doing that actually showed the success with your students?
So yeah, so I, the data from the student evaluations, and I, average the, so I started, let's see, the flipped classroom. I've been at an entirely flipped classroom for 2 semesters. So I have evaluation data from that. And so I took all the, collated all that data, collated the data from when I taught same class, but not a flipped classroom. And then, could see, and then the evaluation is has different, sections about, whether it's, I don't know, engagement or whatever, instructor content, whatever, however they group it. And so I took the data, as a whole, looked at the data for each section, and then could see that a jump in the students who were saying like, strongly agree, or, the most positive answer to that. Does that make sense?
It does. So you're able to use your in-house student evals to get that data. Am I correct in that?
Yes, and what I
Cool.
haven't done, so I also administer the genetics concept assessment. I've done that for several semesters, so pre and post. And what I haven't done yet, but I can go back, I mean, I have the data, is to look at so those would be specific learning gains, as opposed to, you know, student evaluation of the class. And so I could look at the learning gains in a flipped classroom versus a non-flipped classroom. And I just haven't had the time to crunch those numbers.
That's actually reassuring in its own way, though, that like you can use like data you're already getting and not like having to exert like huge amounts of additional lifting to be able to show that there's evidence. That's good that you're
it occurred to me that's kind of one of the undercurrents here, how we are assessed professionally, whether it's, you know, your research portfolio or your teaching portfolio. Some schools tend to have a very ambitious cycle of, you know, refreshing their course evals or to customize course evals. I just led an initiative at my school to change our course evals for the first time in 20 years.
Oh,
there was
wow.
nothing on there that rewarded any type of active learning approach. Either it was, you know, assumed that that was part of what everybody did, because my school tends to have that tradition, but there was nothing that really rewarded it or gave you any good feedback. And so I think that's pretty interesting too. I think with the introduction of Centers for Teaching and Learning, we don't have one, but as I kind of watch the landscape and how maybe even some of the ideas from the SI are trickling into administrative places in these larger institutions, having the course evals that kind of reflect your efforts, you know, in this regard is something that I don't know how prevalent that is. We're doing ours for the first time in 20 years, that there's any kind of recognition that you're doing something other than getting up there and Charlie Brown teacher talking.
I like the hand motion. That's a nice way of summarizing it.
So Karen, they just did something similar at my institution. I mean, I don't know if it's 20 years because I've only been there for 4, but we have a new way that you can do it where you can actually customize the questions as well. So you can take the standard subset, and then if you want to know anything for your own knowledge, you can add that to the course evaluation. So I know that like I've done that, not necessarily for my own learning, but I have a TA that teaches one of my classes or teaches the lab portion of my class, and I want to keep her evaluation separate, but mine's a lecture and lab course. So sometimes I get, if you just look at the course evaluations, for me, it actually half of it is related to her. So I wanted to separate them for when I go up for promotion and tenure. So I can like customize specific to TA questions or specific to, you know, the lecture portion of the class, rather than have to like implement my own survey if I actually wanted to do it. And it's been very helpful actually. And then I can give feedback to my TA that can like help her the next year. That's not tied to my section of the class either.
No, I think that's terrific. I think at my institution, because it's small and everybody has the same thing, when the T&P is like, we want to do apples to apples to apples. There's this mindset that somehow you can't make a comparable argument using a different set of questions, like that they're thematized and you can use the themes to support your portfolio. It's just, I mean, I am just shocked at my institution that they were being so rigid and not kind of being more progressive in a way that really mirrored what most of us do here. So it was an uphill fight though. And I think, I mean, that's seeping over into the barriers. I was kind of like Michael, most of my comments are on the table with the barriers, because maybe that's where my sensitivities lie. But I think, I mean, that's also part of it. How are you being assessed ultimately in terms of your promotion? And if your institution has those mechanisms and that's that mentorship piece too, right? To help you navigate the selection of what you choose to make sure your portfolio is sufficiently rigorous. You know, I think that's part of the conversation.
Well,
Karen, would your institution,
Zach, I see you. We'll get to you in a second. Jamie, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, and the reason that they did it is because we're a STEM only school. So for you to teach a lab and lecture based class, if your evaluation is only based on lecture, or if you teach Gen Bio Lab, how can you have the same series of questions that you're asking of the students for a purely lab class? So that's, and we actually even, I don't know what system we use, but you can actually select, I teach a seminar course, and then it has a whole bunch of seminar type questions. I teach a lecture only course. I teach a lecture and lab course. I teach a lab course, and then customize. And I mean, we're a small school. I know that this is something that they've pushed really hard for, especially for the people who teach labs, because they were kind of getting not great evaluations just because the questions were not related to anything that they were doing at all. So it's definitely something that can be done. And you know, we're small state school, don't have a lot of money. Somehow we managed to implement it. So
do either of you have institutions that would prevent you from doing your own informal surveys? I used to do this all the time and call it a midterm feedback form, or, you know, how's my driving? And so even though you might not be able to cite, you can't take that data and put it into your portfolio for evaluation, but I think you could probably find ways to sneak comments in if
we could
you know, students said something particularly salient.
No, we're encouraged to do that. And we're actually allowed to put whatever we want into our teaching portfolio. So we've, especially with COVID, we have a teaching and learning center, and they actually developed a midterm course evaluation that we could just implement if we wanted to. Questions asked, you can modify it however you wanted. Like, that's something that, especially with the pandemic, that they really encouraged us to do. And they haven't told us we can't put it in our portfolio.
So Zach, what were you gonna put in?
But I'm just going to hop on the bandwagon because obviously I agree with this, right? I think that I think it was Karen's point. I mean, much like in our classroom, if we're not assessing the students on something, it must not be that important, right? I mean, like we assess what's important for our quizzes and exams and finals and whatever. And so therefore we as faculty should be assessed on what's important. And I think that if you can sort of shoehorn or jam in assessment like active learning into P&T, well, one, this is good because it shows us that we need to do it. But also, I think it gives faculty sort of a leverage to say, if I'm being assessed by this, I need some training, right? I need some, you know, formal support, right? I mean, if you as an institution consider active learning or mental health or student well-being, you know, whatever the case may be, if the institution considers it worthy to be in P&T, they'd better support it, at least in theory, right? So I think that it well serves everyone's purposes, and that's a drive that we are having on our campus, which is to modify the P&T criteria to be more reflective of what's actually expected or what we're actually doing, and I think it serves everyone's purpose. It makes us better, and it makes this, and you know, it improves student learning and outcomes also.
So I've scrolled down here to the barriers list. And so I'd ask the same question again about things that correlate maybe to your own experiences. I mentioned on here my own, I guess, hangups with making sure that if I'm going to have students do things in groups, do group projects, that I am doing things that encourage good group dynamics, that I'm making sure that everyone gets their say in. These are things that certainly concern me as a barrier. And we've had discussions in this journal club before. You can read entire pieces of academic work about, you know, designing effective groups for your active learning activities. So we pose the same question to you guys. What barriers here are most striking to you?
What about, I mean, I feel like, I mean, I haven't had too much of a barrier because I feel like I set it up on day one that this is how my class is going to be. But I sometimes have found that the biggest barrier can be students. Sometimes the students just aren't, and I saw that, I'm not sure if it was exactly, but I kind of was trying to pull out, like the students just not wanting to participate, or you have like a bunch of quiet people. So I mean, I just kind of require it, force it, but I'm wondering if other people have had that.
Especially during COVID. I think that's totally unmasked during COVID. Just outcry, you know, just want lecture, and just be, yeah. but I don't think that's just COVID. I think that's kind of, just unmasking the bigger, like, don't make me work, or don't hold me accountable.
One thing that really helps with shy students is being in permanent groups so that they really get to know people. I mean, I am one of those shy people. As an undergrad, I never would have spoken up unless I was surrounded by a couple of people that I felt comfortable with.
It's always funny, by the way, how many of us that are shy end up in this job, but that's another story.
Well, and I actually had the opposite thing happen. I developed some group activities in the beginning of my semester to get the students working together. And then towards the end of the semester, I was like, do you want me to lecture on this, or do you want me to come up with another activity? And they all, the large majority of them wanted more activities. They did not, maybe they just didn't want to hear me speak. And maybe it's because the group activity became a homework. So I gave them free time in class to do their homework with me there to answer any questions that they had, which was designed that way. But yeah, my students seem to, and I randomize the groups, and I think that I don't want to do that this year. I think that I have to figure out in Zoom how to make permanent groups easy. But yeah, I think my students really liked the active learning. The biggest barrier I think that I've had was not one of the ones listed, and that's the difference between students taking my class as a major and a non-major. I have a lot more engagement of students who are taking an upper level chemistry course because they're a chem major versus the students who are taking my class as a directed elective that they had to pick out of 3 as a bio major that like are not interested in 300 level chemistry. And those are the ones that I get the most pushback. Those are the ones that I get the most complaints from. And that to me is my biggest barrier are just the students who don't want to be there. Kind of dragging everybody else down.
I started using this year, and it was because it was tied to a new intro bio textbook that I agreed to help preview. Once a week doing these NetLogo computer simulations of getting students to sit there and like apply some of these concepts. And then I wrote up my own work. I wrote up my own open-ended question worksheets to go with them because the worksheets that we had were just very, very detail oriented. That's not what really I wanted to do. And I think it was effective. The assessment seems to think it was effective. What I was disturbed by to some extent was in some cases the speed in which they got done. Like it's like, oh, I'm going to dedicate a class a week to this, and the class is like 50 minutes long, and like I have this subgroup of students that do their stuff, and we're like 20 minutes in, and they're like, oh, here's the worksheet, it's all done. I'm like, oh, okay. And I'm like, I couldn't figure out if I should feel bad about that or not, but then I guess it's less about time and more about if they had a good experience. But I will say, in terms of my own sort of visceral reaction to my own potential intervention, I was sort of, I was excited to do something different, but also like, okay, I need to fight my urge to give them more busy work just to keep them here for an hour. It's an interesting balance I found myself in thinking about, again, barriers and supports. And so just, Jamie, as you were describing that, that made me think of my own experience with intro bio this year. Anyone else here with
Can I do one more? Can I do one
Yes,
more
please do.
barrier? That I thought is interesting, and I really haven't read that much on it, so this might be more of a Sue and Michael will have a better idea, but like I feel like content, and not the quantity of the content, but like when I first started, and I'm only in my 4th year, the first year I teach a class, I'm lucky if I'm like 2 days ahead of the students.
Oh, yeah.
And that's like impossible to try to integrate a lot of these like big activities that take me days to make and days to find the perfect article for them to read. Like you're just trying to keep up with everything. And I'm finding that now that I've taught my classes 3 or 4 times, I can say, all right, this chunk, I can come up with something cool because I know the content really well. I know what I want them to get out of it. Therefore, I can make an activity out of it. But like trying to do that in your first or second or even 3rd year, like to me that, and all of the classes that I've taught, I've not been an expert in. They've been like, oh, you have a chemistry degree, you can teach analytical chemistry. And I'm like, I haven't seen it in 15 years, but sure. So like I'm learning it with them, but like how can you be expected to create all of this active learning or flipped classroom when you're learning the first 2 years with the students. And I just really haven't seen that much research looking at that aspect. And I would have really liked to see them separate this a little bit more by assistant versus associate professor, or first 2 or 3 years teaching a class versus like 10 years teaching a class. Because I can come up with really cool activities now, but yeah, there's no way in my first like even 2 or 3 years I could have conceptually been able to design the activities, because I just didn't know it that well myself.
I think it's important. Sorry, I looked up just in time to see the cat tail on Mindy's screen, and that was amazing. It was so much better than the whole cat. Like, you could imagine just a person with a cat tail swinging that on your. All right. Anyway, the idea, Jamie, of we want to make all the reforms at once, and we feel we can fix everything in one shot, and so I think that appeal to incrementalism, right, like putting things in over time, and making sure, especially if you're new faculty, to making sure you've got your feet on the ground before you start to go completely ambitious. Mindy, was it you that said you sort of had this plan from the beginning that you were going to do your class in a certain way? In that case, I think you're in a little better shape, because like part of your grounding is just simply doing it that way. But if you're taking an existing class and reforming it, I'm all about, yeah, put it in piece by piece.
Yeah. But it took me a long time to get to that level, just to be clear. I've been teaching the same classes for 13 years. I had to change them.
Okay, so now we take the implementation items here. So what are the things I can do to actually encourage and implement active learning? And you see the different categories that they came up with, from the most frequently recognized, structuring class time to accommodate these activities, all the way down to having a more consideration. This is probably a more diversity, equity, and inclusion considerations, different origins, genders, affiliations. And I'm going to go ahead. So we're going to take these implementation ideas, and what we're going to do, because I want to leave time here to show you, or to talk about the big sort of graph here. We're going to take these implementation measures, we're going to take the strengths, we're going to take the barriers, and we're going to run some stats to try to figure out where the correlations are most obvious. And so this is what you end up with. I'd point out here, because someone actually in the very first session we did noticed the difference in dot size between A and B. And I'm pretty sure that's simply because they wanted to accommodate this onto one figure. I wouldn't read too much into the size of the dots varying between the two. But you see here the way in which, with those correlations, like comparing what you have with the implementation measurements, and you build these really interesting maps of where you find linkages between where there are supports that sort of collate together and where there are barriers that sort of collate together. And this is, I think, the really interesting and maybe surprising, depending on your mindset here, result. That, in fact, where you would think that the biggest issue would be impediments, and if I can remove impediments and barriers, I can make the transition to active learning easier. The correlations here would argue the opposite. That in fact, not that barrier removal is nothing, but that the best thing I can do for you is actually positive rather than negative. That if I go in and I make an effort to include supports into the culture, into the system that you're working in, I'm actually more likely, or have an easier time of being able to bring in active learning strategies, as opposed to going in and trying to actively take barriers out. Again, not to argue you have to do one or the other, but it does give you a result that is somewhat, at least to me, surprising than what you would just expect to happen just casually. So if we look at the correlations we see here, it's not just the supports versus the barriers. It's also the different varieties. You see here the categories and where they fall on here. And so in a lot of cases, just simply doing things to help facilitate the personal preferences that you have as an instructor, little nudge like that could be what allows you to be successful in implementing some active learning practices. You know, there are certain things you can go to every training institute under the sun. If you see something that simply is not something that you value, or that you are uncomfortable doing, that you're maybe not going to do it. And so these little things as personal teaching preferences can in and of themselves be really important. So this is probably the most important, like sort of the summary data that they get from the slide or from the survey. So what are your reactions to this particular visualization and the idea of supports maybe being more important than barriers in terms of these considerations?
I think this figure is really telling, and it took me a while to, and I still don't think I understand the full context of it. Yeah. But just the difference between A and B, and the, as Mike mentioned, the zooming out and lack of connections versus everything interrelated, and yet somewhat separated. If you look at the blue dots in A, and then so personal teaching preferences is intertwined a little with student receptivity, and then you have on the margins, you have academic receptivity and logistics, whereas B is very few connections and everything clusters.
Well, and the categories, the 4 categories are somewhat arbitrary in terms of, you know, here's what they are. And so I don't know if they cluster that way because there was a deliberate, oh, I'm going to assign these categories, or like sort of a chicken or egg question. But that's an important observation you make there, Carlos, in terms of like there's more of an intra clustering than an inter clustering.
The thing I find really reassuring about this particular figure is that while each of us experiences our own unique barriers, it's what we do as a, say, a Palm community, for instance, that can really be the support system. And if we really can support each other and provide enthusiasm and encouragement, that could get people through whatever crap they're dealing with back at home.
I was thinking along the same lines, Sue. I mean, there's this interesting undertone as well about senior versus junior faculty, which I think that is kind of problematic in terms of when do we assume the dinosaurs are going to retire? Like, so I'm in my 16th year. I'm a full professor. I don't want to. I'm not in that group of, you know, senior faculty that's kind of held out to dry here. But this concept of mentoring, and like what this kind of said to me was like, you don't have to do that much, right? You just have to have even just some water cooler conversations when we're all back together, to just kind of remind each other why you're doing what you're doing in the classroom. Like I mean, certainly mentoring programs, even on site. So this gets back to that question of what you do locally versus what you do extramurally. You know, when you're in the trenches, just logistically, it's easier to bump into your colleagues. And if you can just get a, hey, you know, that might just be enough. So, you know, but then, you know, having time to do this and to interact extramurally, you know, what that gives you to come back to, it's kind of like the expectations of what you should expect from your environment, right? Like, you know, we need a center for teaching and learning. You know, I talk to all these people who have them so we can have better course evals.
Of course.
Well, and I think this ties in right to the last article that we read, or the one before it, where it was like you talk to people who have similar thoughts and teaching styles that you do, and you don't talk to people who don't have similar, right? You kind of band with people you know who teach similar to you, and those are the people you ask questions to. the people who just lecture, you don't ask questions about active learning because they're not going to help you. So I think that it kind of ties in with the theme of the last few articles that we've looked at in terms of support and trying to drum up that support. And I think the good thing in our Teaching and Learning Center is fairly new, and we have yearly, like a yearly colloquium where people who do any sort of like active learning or cool exercises, they come, they give a talk, they give a demo, the whole call it. We just had it 2 weeks ago. It was all online. And just hearing, you know, what the person who's teaching Gen Chem and all the cool technology they use, like I had no idea, and as somebody in my own department. So I think, you know, being able to share that information with each other is really important and can really help with that support. But I think that sometimes we just hear a lot more of the negative of the people who are not doing the super cool things rather than the people who are doing the super cool things.
And I think that the concept of support speaks well to what Jamie was just saying, which is if you're at a small institution, there might not be a senior analytical chemist who's kicking around who's ready to do active learning. Right? At a big institution, you reckon there's got to be somebody, statistically speaking, but at a small place, like you might be the one, or not even the one. Like you might be foisted into something that's not even your expertise. So this is a hell of a plug for Palm, right? We should all join Palm because this is an active learning mentorship, right? This is exactly what it is, which is if you can't get it at your institution, you have to get that mentoring, that support network somewhere else.
I think, yeah, so I'll make sure I didn't miss another figure. So I think there's a, depending on your particular context and where you are, you would take different sort of concluding things from this paper. This paper tries to look at the 30,000 foot view of the entire structure of how you could develop and implement active learning. And so I think a lot of your takeaway from this is probably dependent on the things that are most concerned to you, like what your signature issues are. And in that case, sort of to what you guys have been talking about in terms of talking to like-minded people, and to Zach's points, like hopefully we could be those like-minded people, that those sort of supports, and maybe we can be one of those supports, are what can give you that little nudge, the confidence, which is, you know, it's always difficult to rate confidence because it's sort of, you know, a self-eval. But just the ability to have that confidence, at least for me, was first and foremost what was most critical to getting me into more of an active learning mindset. I would never have done this stuff, you know, without having seen examples, gone and heard people talk about it. Things like, I would have loved to have had this when I was more junior. So I certainly appreciate that idea of hopefully we can be that support. All right, any other thoughts on this?
I was just interested by Carlos's comment in chat that it is true that just getting together isn't necessarily a support, because I'm sure you've all had sections of courses that are poisoned. There's somebody in the course that just poisons it for everyone. And the same thing can happen with groups of faculty. So trying to avoid those people, very important.
To control, with the old adage, control what you can and have the patience to know what you can't, or something.
Yes, one of the things that doesn't surprise me about this grouping, though, is that, you know, as we're mapping onto our pedagogy, our science training, I mean, we're all very creative and we're all looking for the next experiment to work. So in some ways, it doesn't surprise me that the positive support stuff is kind of what we glom onto, because if you don't go in that direction, then you're not going to get up in the morning, just like you wouldn't get up in the morning to do your experiment. So I mean, yeah, it's biased because it's coming from the SI alums, but it's also biased just because we're all glass half full kind of people, hopeful that the next experiment's going to get you that little jolt of adrenaline and that little high. Like, we're kind of addicted to that. So I think part of it is just mapping it onto this aspect of our professional selves, right? This is why we do what we do without proper compensation sometimes. It's just like in search of beauty.
That's good. All right. Thank you guys. And like I said at the beginning, it's always nice to see where things go with this. This was a very sort of assessment heavy sort of discussion, which is distinct from the other two that we had. So every time you have this conversation, you sort of learn different things.
What were the other groups focused on?
Well, it's been a week since I've had to think.
Never mind. I retract it.
I just remember it was very distinct. We spent more time, I can tell you, on some of the individual, like Karen, you and I shared that interest in sort of group dynamics. We spent more time like discussing those sorts of things in the other sessions. All right, well, thank you guys very much. And pretty soon we'll have another paper and we'll start another cycle here for your discussion. Have a good day. We'll see you soon.